Here's a number that should make you stop. 30 to 40% of every social media platform is completely silent. Not inactive, not gone, silent. They're there, they're watching. They're reading your captions, seeing your photos, tracking your updates. But they never post, never comment, never share. Researchers call them lurkers. And that word has always bothered me because it implies something's wrong with them. Like they're the strange ones. Like the people posting 3 times a day are the psychologically healthy ones. But what if we have that completely backwards? What if that 30 to 40% aren't the outliers? What if they're the ones who understood the game faster than everyone else and simply decided not to play? That's what we're going to break down today. Not emotionally, not philosophically, psychologically and scientifically, because the data on this group is fascinating and almost nobody is talking about it seriously. Part 1. What the research actually says. Let's start with the study. Research published in Frontiers in Psychology examined why such a large portion of social media users never post. And what they found wasn't shyness. It wasn't introversion. It wasn't fear in the way most people think about fear. It was a combination of 3 specific psychological pressures colliding at once. Social comparison, privacy concern, and external pressure to perform. When those 3 things hit simultaneously, the brain doesn't respond with courage and creativity. It responds with exhaustion and withdrawal. The technical term is cognitive overload. Your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for decision-making, essentially goes on strike. And here's what's critical to understand. This isn't weakness. This is your brain operating exactly as it was designed. When the cost of an action outweighs the perceived reward, rational systems pull back. The people who keep posting through that exhaustion aren't stronger. They've just been conditioned differently. Which brings us to the mechanism nobody wants to talk about. Part 2. Your brain has been conditioned. Social media isn't just an app. It's a behavioral conditioning system, and it was engineered to be one. Psychologists have studied something called intermittent reinforcement for decades. It's the same principle behind slot machines. You don't get a reward every time you pull the lever. Sometimes you do. Sometimes you don't. And that unpredictability, that randomness, is what makes the behavior nearly impossible to stop. Every time you post, you're pulling the lever. Sometimes you get 200 likes. Sometimes you get 12. Sometimes someone shares it. Sometimes nobody responds at all. You never know in advance. And that uncertainty keeps you coming back, keeps you posting, keeps you checking, because maybe this time the lever pays out. People who don't post have, consciously or unconsciously, stepped away from the machine. They're not getting the dopamine hits, but they're also not developing the dependency. They're not waking up at 2 a.m. to check how a post performed. They're not restructuring their weekend around content. They're not making decisions about where to eat, what to wear, or where to travel based on how it'll look to an audience. Their behavior is self-directed, not platform-directed. Self-determination theory in psychology describes this as autonomy, one of 3 core human psychological needs. When you feel genuinely in control of your choices, without external pressure dictating your actions, your mental well-being improves significantly. When autonomy is consistently undermined, when an algorithm is quietly shaping your behavior, well-being degrades. Most people don't feel that degradation happening in real time. It's gradual, it's subtle, but non-posters have either felt it early and responded, or they never entered the conditioning loop in the first place. Either way, their nervous systems are running on a fundamentally different operating system. Part 3. The scoreboard for your identity. Let me put it to you straight. Social media is a scoreboard for your identity. Every post you put out is a data point. Every like is a score. Every comment is a judgment. And that scoreboard isn't private. It's not between you and your close friends. It's public, it's permanent, and it's accessible to literally anyone. Your employer, your ex, someone you went to school with 15 years ago who you haven't spoken to since. A complete stranger at 2 a.m. who stumbled across your profile through a mutual follow. Think about that for a second. Every version of yourself you've ever posted is sitting there, waiting to be judged, anytime, by anyone. There's a sociologist named Erving Goffman who spent his career studying how people manage their image in everyday social life. His argument was simple but profound. He said social interaction works like a theater. You have a front stage, the version of yourself you present to the world, polished, intentional, controlled. And then you have a backstage where you're just you, unfiltered, unperformed, nobody watching. We all need that backstage. That's where you actually recover. That's where you figure out who you actually are when nobody's grading you. What social media did was come in and demolish the backstage completely. There's no off switch anymore. There's no moment that can't be documented. No version of you that's fully protected from public judgment. And for most people, that happened so gradually they just adapted. They started performing full-time without even realizing it. But the people who don't post, they kept their backstage, they protected it. And psychologically, that matters more than most people realize. Research consistently shows that people who don't tie their identity to public validation are more emotionally stable. They handle stress better. They bounce back faster. They're not riding the wave of other people's opinions about them because they built something solid underneath that doesn't need external approval to stay standing. Part 4, the comparison machine. Now here's something I want you to really sit with, because this one's uncomfortable. You don't even have to post to be affected by social media. Just scrolling is enough. Think about the last time you were just casually browsing, no intention to post, just killing time, and then you saw it. Someone's promotion, someone's new house, someone's relationship that looks perfect, someone's body that looks nothing like yours right now. And even though part of your brain said, okay, this is obviously filtered, this is their highlight reel, this is one moment out of their entire messy life, something still shifted inside you, didn't it? That's not weakness. That's just how your brain is wired. Your rational mind knows it's curated, but your emotional brain, the part that processes threat and comparison and status, doesn't wait for your rational mind to catch up. It's already filed the report, already registered the gap between their life and yours, already moved the baseline of what normal looks like slightly out of your reach. And you didn't even post anything. You were just watching. People who don't engage with social media frequently opt out of that entire loop. They're not volunteering to run a race where everyone else gets to choose the track, control the camera, decide what counts as winning, and edit the footage before you even see it. And when you stop running that race, something interesting happens. You stop measuring yourself against it. Your own life starts to feel like enough again, not because it suddenly became objectively better, but because you're not constantly holding it up against someone else's carefully constructed version of theirs. That's why studies show non-posters tend to report higher satisfaction with their own lives, not because they have more, but because they stopped letting a feed decide what enough looks like. Part 5, the architecture of their relationships. Here's the assumption people make about those who don't post. They must be lonely. They must be disconnected. If you're not online, you're not really part of anything, right? Wrong, and the research is pretty clear on this. People who avoid social media tend to have fewer connections but much deeper ones. And when psychologists measure what actually predicts happiness in a person's life, quality of relationships wins over quantity. Every single time. 10 real conversations, ones where someone actually knows what's going on with you, where you can be honest, where nothing is being performed for an audience. Those 10 conversations do more for your well-being than 1,000 people liking a photo of you. Non-posters figured that out, maybe not consciously, maybe they couldn't have written it down as a strategy, but their behavior reflects it. They invest their social energy differently, more selectively, more deeply. And there's something else happening here that's easy to overlook. Because they're not spending mental energy managing a public image, they have bandwidth left over to actually pay attention to the people in front of them. They notice things. They pick up on shifts in tone, changes in someone's energy, the gap between what someone is saying and what they're actually feeling. You probably know someone like this. The person who doesn't say much publicly, but when you actually sit down with them one-on-one, they see you. Properly. They remember things. They ask the right questions. They're genuinely present. That's not an accident. That's what happens when you're not constantly splitting your attention between the real world and your public persona. Part 6. 2 types of self-awareness. Psychologists talk about 2 different kinds of self-awareness, and I think this is where it all starts to click together. The first type is public self-consciousness. That's the voice in your head that's constantly asking, how am I coming across right now? What do people think of me? Is this landing the way I want it to? It's the mental energy you spend managing your image. The second type is private self-consciousness. That's the internal work. What do I actually think about this? What do I genuinely want? What kind of person am I becoming? Does the way I'm living actually reflect what I value? Social media is basically a machine designed to keep you locked in the first type. Every feature, the likes, the view counts, the comment sections, the follower numbers, all of it is pulling your attention outward, toward how you're perceived, away from who you actually are. Non-posters tend to live more in the second type, and over time that creates a fundamentally different relationship with yourself. When you're not constantly performing for an audience, you get your own mental space back. You can sit with uncomfortable questions. You can notice when something feels off in your life without immediately framing it as content. You can build an identity from the inside out instead of the outside in. And here's the thing, that kind of identity is stable. It doesn't spike when a post does well and crash when it doesn't. It doesn't need weekly confirmation from strangers to stay intact. That's a genuinely different psychological foundation, and most people don't even realize they've traded it away. Part 7. The real critique of the performance economy. Let's be honest about what social media built at a cultural level. It built a marketplace where attention is the currency, and your identity is the product. And like any marketplace, the incentives shape what gets made. When attention is what you're selling, authenticity becomes expensive. Real human experience, complicated, unresolved, messy, boring in the middle, doesn't perform well. It doesn't get shared. It doesn't go viral. What performs is the transformation, the highlight, the perfectly timed moment of vulnerability that's still somehow aspirational, the version of struggle that's already been resolved into a lesson. So the market selects for performance, and people who stay in it long enough start to internalize those preferences. They start editing themselves before they even post. Start filtering their actual emotional experience through the question of how it'll land. And eventually, it becomes hard to tell the difference between what you genuinely feel and what you've learned performs well. Non-posters never made that trade. They kept the unedited version of themselves, and some of them will tell you directly, certain experiences are just better when they're not being produced. That sunset hits differently when you're not trying to capture it. That conversation goes somewhere real when nobody's mentally composing the caption. That achievement feels like yours when it's not waiting on external confirmation to feel complete. They stayed inside their own lives instead of producing them for an audience. Part 8. What this tells us about where we're going. Here, what I think is worth taking seriously as we move forward. We got to a place, faster than anyone really noticed, where silence became suspicious, where not posting became more conspicuous than posting, where the burden of proof flipped. Now you have to explain why you're not sharing rather than why you are. Think about how strange that is. Think about how recent that is. And the people who held the line on their own privacy, who quietly said no to that shift, who refused to hand their interior life over to a platform, those people are sitting on something valuable, something that's getting rarer. Mental bandwidth is finite. Genuine presence is finite. The capacity to actually be inside your own life instead of producing it, that's finite too. And how you spend those resources shapes who you become. The data suggests non-posters are spending them differently, on depth instead of reach, on presence instead of performance, on a sense of self that doesn't need an algorithm's approval to feel real. That's not antisocial. That's not fear. That's not missing out. That might be the most psychologically intelligent response to the digital age that most of us are still figuring out. The most independent, most grounded, most self-aware people in this era might not have a following. They might not even have a profile. If this gave you something real to think about, subscribe. These videos take serious research, and I want to keep going deeper.